It was obvious from the very beginning that nothing would happen and that Moscow was not in any danger. And this was all wishful thinking on behalf of the Americans and their allies. And unfortunately, non-Western elites or pro-Western elites and those who are simply naive. We've seen these sort of stories with regards to Iran and other countries, often how they mislead public opinion. And ultimately, they all turn out to be wrong. But again, these many people in the West and some of these non-Westerners who are pro-Western, they are fooled every time. And then we move on to the next story.
Well, I'm going to pick you up on that very, very shortly, how this was covered in the West and the reaction to it. But what do you think is going to happen to Prigozhin and Wagner now? Is this it? Is he going to delete Telegram, hang up his rifle, put his feet up in a country house in Belarus? Or do you think this spat will continue with the MOD?
Well, obviously, you would know more about events in Russia than I. I would imagine that if he was smart, he would stay out of Russian politics. And his troops, since they were fighting against Western-backed extremists that have come to power, unfortunately, in Ukraine, I think it's a smart move to be forgiving to them. But you know, one of the ironies is that we had a similar experience in Iran when Saddam Hussein, with Western help, invaded our country. A group, the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq organization, they turned against the state during the war, and they went to Europe, and then they went and fought for Saddam Hussein. And they became despised because you don't turn against your own country during war, especially when the war is being directly or indirectly imposed upon you by aggressive Western powers.
Obviously, the world was watching very closely yesterday. Just briefly, how was this covered in Iran? How much attention was paid to this situation?
Well, in Iran, there are two camps. One is, I would say, the majority, who are very critical of the West and the United States and very politically aware. And they saw through the Western propaganda immediately. They did not believe that there would be any change in Moscow, and they did not want any change in Moscow. And there's this pro-Western liberal minority who will believe anything that comes out of Washington or London, whether it's CNN or BBC Persian, it doesn't make a difference. They will usually mimic what they have to say and repeat their claims and statements. So they were humiliated because they were saying that basically all is over in Moscow. And when I was on my way to Moscow last night, I told people that nothing will happen. And by the time I got to Moscow on my 3-hour flight, it was over.
It was over. Yeah, it was a very, very quick end, wasn't it, to the situation? And as you mentioned, there were some very dramatic headlines in many of the Western press this morning saying that Putin was on the brink, Russia was on the brink of civil war, which, of course, you know, we now know not to be true, and everything's very calm across Russia now. There were two newspapers, the Washington Post and the New York Times, which did suggest that US intelligence was aware of Prigozhin's plans. In the middle of June, they did know about it. They informed their superiors in that. And they did express concern about the risk of civil war and what that would have on Russia's nuclear capabilities. How responsible was it of them not to warn the Kremlin if they were that worried?
Well, there are a few ways of looking at this. If we assume that they knew, then they were behaving very irresponsibly if they were fearful of nuclear weapons falling into the wrong hands. So that shows that they are completely irresponsible. But also, if they really did know, and I'm not sure they did, because after events take place, everyone can claim anything. And the Washington Post is known to say what the deep state and what the U.S. intelligence services want them to say. But if they knew, then why were they so foolish? Why was their response over the last 24, 48 hours and the response of the Western media that is so close to the political establishment, why was it so horrible? Why did they predict things so badly? So either way, they don't come out in a good light.
No, and staying on this topic, there was another headline by the Wall Street Journal which said that the US now intends to postpone the introduction of further sanctions on Wagner for fear of siding with Putin here. Now, how do you explain that, considering that the US has always considered Wagner to be a terrorist organization? Postponing sanctions on them seems quite extraordinary.
Well, that's why I always say the worst violator of human rights across the globe is the United States and its Western allies, because they are the most hypocritical. They speak about human rights, they preach about human rights, they claim to be the great supporters of human rights, but they will support the most dirty of the dirty if it suits their purposes. We saw that when they supported the Contra rebels. We saw that when they supported Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Azov brigade or the battalion back then, and other such extremist groups. So if they see an interest in Wagner, regardless of what it is or how good it is or whether it's good or bad, that's beyond the point. If they see that it could possibly serve their purpose, they'll support it. If it doesn't serve their purpose, they'll stand against it. So they have no moral principles, but what makes the Western regimes worse than any other is the fact that they have no principles, but they pretend that they have the highest of moral standards.
Well, indeed, and leading on from that, it seems like the Wagner Group may have undergone a transition itself in the space of 24 hours, from being Putin's, in the West perception, convict army conducting shady ops in Africa to sort of virtuous rebellers now in Russia, and now back to
Who
a
want to
rogue
clean
mercenary.
politics. They want to clean the Kremlin. Yes, of course, it's utterly hypocritical, and they assume that we have no memory of what they were saying 2 weeks ago, and many unfortunately don't. In the West, a lot of people are ignorant, and across the globe there is that segment of pro-Western elites that they don't seem to have a very good memory, or they pretend that they don't remember.
Now, moving on now, obviously, Putin did inform his neighbors about the situation in Russia, including the President Erdogan of Turkey. And Erdogan, Turkey, expressed support for Russia in this situation. As a NATO member, I can't believe that would have done Erdogan many favors with his allies in NATO.
Yes, but that also exposes the fact that NATO is on the decline. No matter what they say in the West about how NATO is now stronger than ever before, we see that the population across Europe is now increasingly divided. And as things get worse, political awareness usually increases. We saw that during Vietnam, too, when initially almost all Americans supported the war, but gradually as it became more difficult for the United States, there was increasingly a larger anti-war movement. So the mood in Turkey is not pro-West. And of course, countries like Iran are completely supportive of the legitimate government in Moscow, and Iran would never side with the United States or the Europeans on any such thing, because we are in the same boat. We have experienced the same sort of U.S. aggression and animosity for over 4 decades now. So we understand quite well where the people of Russia stand and what the Americans and the Europeans are trying to do to Moscow.
And indeed, finally, one more question. How do you think the events of yesterday, what ramifications will they have on the war in Ukraine as a whole? There were many predicting that Ukraine would somehow use this disturbance to its advantage somehow on the battlefield. Do you think when it comes to that, it will shape the war in Ukraine, or will things be as they were before?
Well, my experience over the last 24 hours is very anecdotal, but I believe from what I've seen, that Russians are uh, today in a much stronger position. They feel empowered. They feel that uh, they've won this battle, and I assume, and from what I've read, I think that Russia's opponents in the West are dismayed. And so, ironically, the events of the last couple of days have weakened, in my opinion, the Ukrainian regime and their backers, and they have empowered Russia. That's my personal belief, and it's anecdotal, but I think it's probably, there's a good chance that that's not wrong.
Well, Professor Said Mohammed Morandi of the University of Tehran, thanks for your time and for sharing your thoughts with us on those dramatic past 24 hours in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you.